November 1943. The Moro River Valley, Italy. Captain Ernst Weber pressed his spine against the rough, freezing stone of the farmhouse wall, his breath hitching in short, sharp bursts that bloomed like white smoke in the frigid air. The silence of the valley was heavy, unnatural. In a war defined by the deafening roar of artillery and the mechanical stutter of machine guns, this silence was terrifying. It was in this silence that 3 of his men had died. They had not fallen to a barrage of mortar fire or a storm of shrapnel. They had simply ceased to exist. One moment they were vibrant, living men talking about letters from Berlin or the warmth of a fire. The next, they were corpses cooling in the mud. There was no warning. There was no sound of a shot, at least, not until after the bullet had already done its gruesome work. Weber had been a soldier since the invasion of Poland in 1939. He knew the chaotic symphony of combat. He knew the rhythm of an infantry assault. But this was something else entirely. This was a systematic dismantling of his unit by a ghost. The first man had died at dawn, the flare of his lighter as he tried to ignite a cigarette acting as a beacon for death. The second man fell 3 hours later, killed instantly while carrying ammunition across a sunken road that was supposed to be safe ground, fully 200 meters behind the front line. But it was the death of the third man, Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann, that shattered the unit's morale. Hoffmann was a hardened veteran who had survived the frozen hell of Stalingrad. He knew how to survive. He had died while carefully peering through his binoculars at the Canadian positions across the valley. The bullet had passed clean through his right eye. Weber found the binoculars later in the dirt, one lens shattered into a spiderweb of glass, blood freezing into dark crystals on the metal frame. The shot had come from somewhere in the hills to the north, a distance that seemed impossibly far. Weber had scanned those hills until his eyes watered, but he saw nothing except swirling fog and the skeletal fingers of bare trees. There was no muzzle flash, no puff of smoke, nothing to target. The physics of it did not make sense. The range, the wind, the biting cold, it should have been impossible to hit a man-sized target, let alone an eye socket. Now, his remaining 12 soldiers huddled in the damp darkness of the farmhouse basement. Their rifles were loaded, their hands gripping the wood stocks white-knuckled, but their weapons were useless against an enemy they could not see. The psychological weight was crushing them. Young Private Schneider, a boy of barely 18 with peach fuzz still on his cheeks, sat rocking back and forth, whispering the same word over and over into his knees, Hexerei. Witchcraft. Weber wanted to slap him. He wanted to shout, to restore the iron discipline of the Wehrmacht, to tell the boy to act like a German soldier. But his hand would not move. He looked at the terror in the eyes of his men and realized he could not lie to them. Schneider was not wrong. How else could you explain it? The Canadians were killing his men from distances that defied the ballistic charts, through weather conditions that blinded normal men, with an accuracy that broke every rule of warfare Weber had ever learned. They were being hunted not by a soldier, but by a phantom that commanded the wind itself. Across the valley, nestled in a shallow depression hidden among dead grapevines and jagged rocks, Sergeant Harold Marshall lay perfectly still. He had been in this exact position for 6 hours. The biting cold of the Italian winter had stopped bothering him around hour 3, fading into a dull, manageable background noise. That was normal for him. In the unforgiving expanse of Manitoba, where he came from, you learned to ignore the cold, or you died. He had spent entire winters tracking wolves through boreal forests where the temperature dropped to 40 below zero, turning the air itself into shards of ice. In that world, he learned that patience was the only currency that mattered. He learned that movement meant death, and that the hunter who moved first usually lost. The German soldiers shivering in the farmhouse across the valley did not understand this fundamental law of nature yet, but they would. Marshall was 32 years old, which made him ancient compared to the fresh-faced 18-year-olds who filled the ranks of his unit. Before the war, he had not been marching in parades or polishing brass buttons. He had guided hunting parties through the dense wilderness north of Lake Winnipeg. Rich men from Toronto and New York paid him handsomely to help them find moose and bear. Marshall remembered them with a faint, cynical amusement. Most of them were terrible hunters. They talked too much, their boots crunched loudly on the dry pine needles, and they smelled of city soap and tobacco. They expected the animals to simply appear because they wanted them to, because they had paid for the privilege. Marshall would watch them waste expensive ammunition on shots they had no chance of making, then complain that the forest was empty. But the forest was never empty. You just had to know how to look, how to wait until the forest decided to show itself to you. The Canadian Army, much like those city tourists, did not know what to do with Marshall at first. He was not a career soldier. He did not fit into the rigid, polished structure of military hierarchy. He could not march in formation without looking slightly awkward, his gait suited for navigating uneven forest floors rather than marching on paved parade grounds. Other sergeants made jokes about the quiet Indian guide from the frozen north. That was the nickname they gave him, even though Marshall was white and had never claimed to be anything else. But there was a grain of truth in the jest. He had learned his tracking methods from Cree hunters who worked the trap lines near his cabin. They had taught him how to read the wind by the feel of it on his cheek, how to use the terrain to mask his silhouette, and how to become invisible in plain sight. Then, someone gave him a rifle and asked him to shoot. Marshall put 5 bullets through the center of a target at 400 meters. The range officer, assuming it was a fluke, demanded he do it again. Marshall did. He never missed. Not because he was naturally talented though he was, but because he never took a shot unless he was absolutely certain. In the woods, during the lean years of the Depression, ammunition was expensive and heavy. You did not waste bullets on a maybe. You waited for the perfect moment, the sure thing, and then you made it count. To Marshall, a bullet was a finite resource, and firing one was a commitment he refused to break. The British Army treated sniper programs as an afterthought, small and disorganized. The Americans were arguably worse, still trying to figure out if a sniper was a distinct role or just a scout with a lucky aim. Most commanders viewed the battlefield through the lens of volume. They believed in the crushing weight of artillery and the suppression of machine gun fire. To them, sniping was a parlor trick, not a military strategy. When Marshall first suggested using snipers differently not just for reconnaissance, but as a weapon of psychological terror, his first company commander laughed at him. Why waste a trained soldier on single targets when I can call in a battery of 25-pounders to level the grid square? The commander had asked. Why spend hours setting up one shot when a Vickers gun can spit out 500 rounds a minute? Marshall tried to explain the difference in currency. A machine gun made noise. Artillery shattered the earth. These things were terrifying, yes, but they were understandable. The enemy knew where you were. They could shoot back, they could take cover, they could react. But a sniper, a patient sniper who took one perfect shot and then dissolved into the landscape, created a different kind of fear. It was the fear of the unknown. It was the paralyzing knowledge that you could die while tying your bootlace, with no warning, no sound, and no chance to fight back. That kind of fear did not just kill men. It froze entire units. Most officers dismissed him, but Lieutenant General Guy Simons did not. Simons commanded the Canadian forces in Italy, and he was a pragmatist who understood that the mountainous Italian campaign was bleeding his army dry. The Germans were dug into defensive positions carved out of solid rock. Every assault was costing hundreds of lives for mere meters of ground. Traditional tactics were failing. Simons needed a scalpel, not a hammer. He authorized the creation of specialized sniper sections and gave Marshall free rein to equip them. Marshall's choice of weapon raised even more eyebrows than his theories. He bypassed the standard issue Lee Enfield and reached back into history for the Ross Mark III. To the average Canadian soldier, the Ross was a cursed weapon. In the muddy trenches of the First World War, the Ross had been a disaster. It jammed when dirty, it was temperamental, and it had failed Canadian troops when they needed it most. It was a symbol of bureaucratic failure. But Marshall knew a secret that the infantrymen did not. The Ross had failed as a trench weapon because it was built like a precision sporting rifle, with tight tolerances that could not handle mud. However, in the hands of a sniper who kept his weapons surgically clean, those tight tolerances were a gift. The Ross possessed a straight pull-bolt action that was faster and smoother than the clunky Lee Enfield. It had a longer barrel and superior harmonics. Marshall took this failure of a rifle and turned it into an instrument of high science. He modified the trigger mechanism, filing the sear until it broke cleanly at exactly 3 pounds of pressure, light enough for a heartbeat shot, heavy enough to be safe. He hand-loaded his own ammunition, measuring gunpowder grains on a pharmacist's scale to ensure that every bullet left the barrel at the exact same velocity. He mounted a Canadian-made telescopic sight with 3.5 power magnification and spent hours aligning the crosshairs until they were true at 800 meters. While other soldiers played cards or slept, Marshall was at the range, scribbling in his notebook, turning ballistics into a math problem he could solve. He was not just a soldier anymore. He was a craftsman, and the war was his workshop. Now, 6 hours into his vigil, Marshall finally saw what he was waiting for. A German officer appeared at the edge of the farmhouse window. It was a fleeting mistake, just a moment of carelessness to check on his men. He was 780 meters away, obscured by the morning fog and the shimmering distortion of the cold air. By every standard measure of 1943 infantry combat, he was safe. He was beyond the effective range of a rifle, and certainly beyond the capability of a human eye without aid. Marshall did not jerk the trigger. He did not rush. He exhaled slowly, emptying his lungs until they were halfway deflated, a technique to stop his chest from heaving. He closed his eyes for a second, feeling the pulse in his fingertips, willing his heart rate to drop. Thump, thump, thump. He opened his eyes. He calculated the windage not by guess, but by watching the way the fog drifted lazily through the valley floor. He aimed slightly high and to the left, compensating for the bullet's drop and the gentle push of the breeze. He squeezed. The recoil of the Ross was sharp, but the movement was fluid. The German officer dropped without a sound. Marshall did not stay to watch the body fall. He was already moving, sliding backward through the dead grapevines, pressing his body flat against the frozen mud. This was the first rule of his Patience Doctrine: one shot, then disappear. Never take a second shot from the same position. Never give the enemy the satisfaction of a muzzle flash to aim at. He crawled 30 meters before daring to stand, then walked calmly back toward the Canadian lines like a man taking a morning stroll. His spotter, Private Tommy Chun, followed 10 meters behind. Back at the forward command post, Marshall cleaned his rifle with obsessive care while Chun recorded the shot in their logbook. Distance, 780 m. Conditions, heavy fog, light NW wind. Result, confirmed kill, enemy officer. The logbook was Marshall's Bible. Every shot had to be documented. This was not guesswork. It was science married to hunting instinct. He was building a dataset to prove that patience was lethal. This philosophy came directly from the Canadian wilderness. Wolves were smart predators. If they saw movement, they vanished. You could not chase a wolf through the forest. You had to identify its trail, predict its path, and wait. Sometimes you waited all day. Sometimes you waited 3 days. But when the wolf finally stepped into the clearing, walking calmly because it felt safe, that was when you struck. One bullet. The pack would then avoid that area for months, remembering the danger. Marshall wanted the Germans to feel that same primal memory. He wanted them to fear every open space, every window frame, every patch of sunlight. The validity of his doctrine was proven in blood during the Battle of Ortona in December 1943. The town was a nightmare of medieval stone buildings and narrow streets, a fortress perfectly suited for German defense. Canadian infantry were being chewed up, losing men for every room they cleared. Marshall deployed a sniper section, just 3 men, into a church bell tower overlooking the main square. For 16 hours, those 3 men controlled the entire sector. Any German soldier who tried to cross the square died. Any officer who peeked through a shutter died. The Germans could not advance. They could not retreat. An entire company was pinned down, paralyzed by 3 rifles. A captured German lieutenant later confessed to his interrogators that his men refused to move because of the ghost in the tower. They could not hear the shots until the bodies hit the ground. Some of his men, terrified and exhausted, had started whispering that the Canadians had invented invisible bullets, or worse, that it was magic. By the summer of 1944, the war had shifted. The Canadian Army moved from the rocky, sun-bleached spines of Italy to the lush, suffocating bocage of Normandy. The terrain was a nightmare of a different breed. Instead of sweeping valleys, soldiers faced a labyrinth of high earthen walls topped with dense thickets, turning every field into a fortress and every road into a bowling alley for machine gun fire. But if the Germans thought the change in scenery would blind the Canadian ghosts, they were mistaken. The snipers simply adapted. They traded the gray stone camouflage of Ortona for the vibrant greens and browns of the French countryside, sewing burlap and vegetation into their uniforms until they looked less like men and more like mossy stumps or patches of hedge. It was here, in the hedgerow hell, that the legend grew from battlefield rumor into statistical fact. German intelligence officers began compiling disturbing reports from the front. In sectors facing American or British troops, German officer casualties hovered around 12 to 15% of total deaths, a standard grim statistic of war. But in sectors facing the Canadians, that number spiked to a terrifying 38%. Even stranger, the reports noted that these deaths often occurred at ranges exceeding 600 meters, distances where standard infantry combat simply did not happen. The Wehrmacht tried to counter this with their own marksmen. They brought in Scharfschützen veterans from the Eastern Front who had cut their teeth fighting the Russians. These were dangerous men, aggressive hunters trained to roam the battlefield, take multiple shots, and suppress the enemy with volume. But this aggression was their undoing. A German sniper might fire 20 times in a day, racking up kills but inevitably revealing his position. A Canadian sniper might fire once in 3 days. The difference in philosophy was lethal. The German snipers were playing a numbers game. The Canadians were playing a game of psychological dominance. Corporal James Wallace became the embodiment of this doctrine. A farm boy from Saskatchewan with eyes like a hawk and a nervous system that seemed immune to adrenaline, Wallace became a legend near the village of Norrie and Besson. In June 1944, Wallace spotted a German artillery observer hiding in a church steeple 850 meters away. The observer was a high-value target, raining destruction down on Canadian advances by radioing coordinates to heavy batteries miles away. The steeple offered a firing port barely 40 centimeters wide, partially blocked by rubble. To make the shot, Wallace had to thread a bullet through that tiny gap across nearly a kilometer of open ground, with crosswinds that shifted unpredictably between the hedgerows. Wallace waited for 40 minutes. He did not just watch the target. He watched the grass ripple in the fields halfway between them. He watched the smoke from a burning tank drift in the distance. He was building a three-dimensional map of the air currents in his mind. When the observer finally leaned forward, Wallace fired. The bullet traveled for more than a full second, arcing high into the air, pushed left by one wind current, and then nudged back right by another, before plunging through the stone opening and striking the observer in the chest. German records captured days later noted the death of the observer at 09:40 hours. The entry was brief and confused, killed by small arms fire. Range and method unknown. Shot described as impossible. The Germans could not calculate the math, so they defaulted to fear. They stopped manning the towers. They stopped walking on the roads. The mere presence of a Canadian unit in the sector forced the enemy to crawl through the mud like insects, terrified of the silence. The war ended in May 1945, and the silence that followed was louder than any artillery barrage. Harold Marshall returned to Manitoba in late autumn, trading the blood-soaked mud of Europe for the crisp, clean snow of home. He received his discharge papers, packed his uniform away in a cedar chest, and went back to the only life he truly understood, guiding hunting parties through the wilderness. To his neighbors, he was just Harold the quiet man who liked to fish, played a decent fiddle at the community hall dances, and knew where the moose bedded down in winter. They did not know about the nightmares that woke him gasping in the dark, his mind replaying the faces he had seen through his scope in the split second before he pulled the trigger. They did not know about the logbook. On a cold January morning in 1946, Marshall stood before his wood stove, the small leather-bound book heavy in his hand. It contained the coordinates, the wind speeds, and the confirmed kills of over 80 men. It was a record of death, precise and scientific. Marshall opened the stove door and tossed the book into the flames. He watched the paper curl and blacken, the ink of his handwriting disappearing into ash. He was not destroying history. He was compartmentalizing his soul. The war was over. The hunting of men was done. But while Marshall chose silence, his methods screamed through the corridors of military academies for decades to come. The Patience Doctrine did not die in the ashes of that logbook. British and American officers, stunned by the effectiveness of the Canadian ghosts, requested immediate access to the training manuals. They needed to understand how a small army of farm boys and trappers had terrified the most disciplined military force on Earth. Men like Corporal Wallace stayed behind, becoming instructors who passed the flame to a new generation. The lessons learned in the Italian fog and the French hedgerows became the bedrock of modern sniper warfare. When war broke out in Korea, and later in the jungles of Vietnam, the snipers deployed were spiritual descendants of Marshall's unit. The military had finally learned the lesson Marshall tried to teach them in 1943, that one bullet, fired with absolute precision after days of waiting, was worth more than 1,000 rounds sprayed in panic. The philosophy shifted from volume to value. The sniper was no longer a scout. He was a strategic asset, a force multiplier capable of denying ground to an entire battalion. Marshall died in 1987 at the age of 76. His obituary in the Winnipeg Free Press was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his love for his 7 grandchildren and his skill as a guide. It said he served in World War II. It did not mention that he was one of the deadliest men to ever walk a battlefield. The German soldiers who had whispered of witchcraft in their trenches were mostly gone by then, too. But the truth they feared was far more profound than magic. They had not been fighting sorcerers. They had been fighting men who had mastered the oldest human skill, the ability to be still, to watch, and to strike only when the moment was perfect. In our modern age of drone warfare and satellite surveillance, there is something haunting about looking back at the legend of the Canadian sniper. Technology has made killing easier, cleaner, and more distant. But it has not made it more frightening. A drone is a machine. It has no soul to bargain with. But a man lying in the mud, slowing his heart rate, waiting 3 days for you to make a single mistake, that is a terror that speaks to our primal brain. The Germans called them ghosts because they could not accept that they were just men. They could not accept that patience, when refined to a razor's edge, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Marshall and his men proved that in the chaotic noise of war, the most terrifying sound is not the explosion, it is the silence that follows the perfect shot.